Do you have an opinion on a city that is more fruitful to building a political gaming startup?
I don't think Austin is a city that's focused on super early stage and gaming.
What works for AI companies probably doesn't work for political companies.
Why we invested in this kid.
What things did you not focus on that are important to focus on when you're starting out?
Marketing is almost always the answer in that, but it's not always the answer. Nobody remembers that Adidas was the actual sponsor of the Olympics.
What's the reason for people not wanting work from home?
Amazon called back so many of their people back to office. And I think all of that comes from a lack of trust.
What do you think is the most important in your team's culture on your road to success? Hey guys, welcome back to Funds and Founders. We have our first guest back on today for episode number, enter over here depending on what we end up doing.
No.
But what's the last year been like for you?
Well, I'm still wearing the same hat. It's been an interesting year, and I think you and I, for anybody who doesn't know, we're actually friends, right? So hope that doesn't ruin it, the mystique for anybody to think that I'm just some guy that you asked to be on the show, but we're actually friends. So we talk quite a bit, but I think one of the things we talk about is, as a founder, it's a very interesting 2024 and 2023 were very interesting years to raise money. So I think that environment, I learned a ton since the last time we talked. Just kind of my own observations, and in, developing relationships with different VCs, even venture investors that were not going to be my investor, but just going to events and hearing what they're dealing with. So I think there was a lot of learning in the last 12 months, which I'm incredibly grateful for. And I think that was the single most challenging aspect of the last 12 months as a founder. While at the same time, our team has grown. We've invested even more now in the last quarter in our design, kind of really putting the finishing touches or putting those special touches on the actual product. And then a lot of travel. So San Francisco a couple of times, Deep Tech Week, DC a couple of times because we're in the political space with our contest, and then both the conventions, the presidential conventions in Milwaukee and Chicago. So at a very high level, those are kind of the highlights that we can drill down to each one of those. And I would just add the single biggest learning is just the importance of user acquisition for a consumer app. It's marketing, finding product market fit, and then having friends on the B2B space. It's a little bit different. It's more sales, in my opinion, for the user acquisition on the B2B space. So there's a kind of a divergence there, but it's the same goal, which is finding your customers and then delighting them and getting them to become missionaries for you. So
makes sense. You mentioned traveling a lot for the startup, right?
Yeah.
Do you have an opinion on a city that is more fruitful to building a political gaming startup?
Yeah.
Have you noticed differences in the places you've been, or would you say it doesn't matter where you are?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It's interesting. I don't know that there are a ton of companies trying to, focus on doing what we're doing. There have been, we could talk about the regulatory environment. There have been some very interesting court rulings lately, but the beneficiaries of those court rulings have been companies like Kalshi and Polymarket and Predictit, and they're kind of spread out geographically, so I don't know that it matters as much. Polymarket is backed by Peter Thiel, with some involvement by Nate Silver. The former speaker Kevin McCarthy's involved with them. So they have, I think geographically, I don't know that it matters where they are. I would say it might be, and I think it's something we've talked about, that there are cities that are geared towards stages and geared towards verticals or industries. And it may not matter 100%, but it may matter when it comes to raising. So you may be traveling a lot to do a roadshow for investors because your ideal investor may not actually be in your geographic location. So I think that's been the case for us. I don't think Austin is a city that's focused on super early stage and gaming. And so I think San Francisco and LA, San Francisco is a bit of a generalist space when it comes to VC. You'll find every VC in San Francisco. LA is very much a gaming city, in my opinion. And because of that, I think also early stage to late stage investing in that specific vertical in LA. So that may not be a precise answer, but I think it is something as a founder, as you do your research, you will find that they are geographically, you will see where they're together, where there's like a globbing together of specific VCs for verticals or stage. Does that answer?
Yeah. And so the reason I ask is I think you said people understood your idea a little more or resonated more with what you're trying to build.
Right.
And the reason I think that's important is when you're trying to raise or trying to get customers or trying to get partners for your brand, understanding what challenges you might face as a startup makes it easier to justify why you're raising X amount. Or that's why I ask, because I remember when you went to DC, you said, oh yeah, people got it. People understood it. People understood both sides of the regulation plus what you're trying to build, and eventually it's a data company, right? That's why I asked, does location matter? Because when you're in proximity to those kinds of startups, those kinds of VCs, maybe it helps morph your idea a little better. Versus in Austin, you're not meeting a bunch of gaming political people, so you're not bouncing off ideas. You're not like, oh, here's a customer acquisition strategy that would work, because what works for AI companies probably doesn't work for political companies, which is why I ask, is there benefit to being somewhere co-located with that industry?
Well, it's interesting. I think you really touched on something there. And I think for a founder or for a company in its early stage, you ask yourself, is it better to be co-located geographically by your ideal customer or your ideal investor? And they may not actually be in the same space. So I don't actually think just because Los Angeles is very much a gaming town, I don't know that that's where your ideal customers are, right? As a company, you may be best served by being located in South Korea, heavily into the esports space in South Korea, right? So the US market may not even be your ideal market initially. Because I do think, I'm going to say something after this, but I do think one possible strategy is to find the smallest possible initial market and dominate that market, and to get a virality factor, a product market fit where you do it gets to the point where it's almost unnecessary to do marketing because it's small enough and you get so much traction. And then from there, use that as a way of spreading out in a bigger way, right? Now to go back and say this, something I thought about today on my run was there are different ways of living, and one of them is a very prescribed way of doing things and one is not. So I just gave a prescription, but it may or may not be true. I think you have to test it yourself, but it is something that I've seen that the smallest possible market, it can be a very successful strategy for that initial till you get to a Series A, at which point you're going to need to show rapid growth. So yeah, but I think you hit something there, which is, do you want to be co-located? Where do you want to be co-located with? And with the internet and with app stores and stuff like that, maybe you don't need to be. Yeah. But if you're going to market to people, it becomes easier to in-person marketing, events, things that can actually be lower cost of acquisition for users if you're in the same space. So that's one way of thinking about it.
Makes sense. And transitioning into your learnings from raising, learnings from talking to VCs, what's one or two things you learned over the last year? What channels work? What kind of traction are people looking for? What's an insight you got?
Well, I think this is a place where I could say some things that like would be considered hot takes and maybe like make me, sound a very specific way, but I would say that the biggest lesson is that there are no rules. So one thing is if you just do a YouTube search of videos about how to raise money, I can't think of his name right now, but he's the founder of Founder Suite. I think he actually has some really great advice for founders that are raising. And if you listen to his prescriptions, it makes a lot of sense. One thing he'll tell you is the first thing you need to do is just organize everything. You need to have a clean data room. You need to organize everything. And then the next thing you need to do is to generate a pipeline of well-researched investors and focus only on about 200 well-researched and they should be in your vertical, at your stage, all of these things, right? They need to have the thesis that fits you, right? That's a great thing. However, you will inevitably also come across stories of people, and there's one that I can think of very specifically from LinkedIn that was shared by a VC, like, this is why we invested in this kid. And all he did was scrape LinkedIn of about 1,000 VCs and mass emailed all of them. No research, no focus, but a scattershot shotgun approach to it. And it worked. He closed a $2 million initial round. And when you read that, you could either become frustrated and be like, oh, so everything that they told me is fucking bullshit. Or you can realize that there is no right way. The only right way is to do something. Take a step forward, adjust as you get feedback, consistently experiment and learn. Okay? And another add-on to that that's a very personal experience that I've shared with you is that we have a great law firm. They have a business development service and very happy with them. At the same time, we have great advisors who do warm intros, and the business development of the law firm, they will do outreach to investors for us. And at the same time, I'm consistently nurturing our pipeline because we went more the first route where we really researched and had a pipeline of a little over 200 investors. Researching who can give a warm intro, what founders do we know who can give us a warm intro. While at the same time, I have taken upon myself to do cold emails. And the hit rate, the response rate has been higher on my own cold outreach than the warm intros. Goes against all expected results, right? It goes against everything anybody would tell you, but that's the case. So I don't know that you give up on the warm intros. I think for me, it makes sense to do both, but realizing where you're getting the most traction, you lean more into that one. But that's just an example, actually, of the
So when does the cold emailing guide course drop for?
I will tell you that the best two pieces of advice I would give someone about that is that there are, I want to say it was Sequoia Capital maybe in their blog or their like little tab that's like documents available for founders or articles or whatever. I think it was Sequoia, but it was like how to write a cold outreach email. And I think if you start from that and then you start to tailor it and you start to realize it could be shorter, it could be more to the point, I would say that. And everybody, and I've told this to numerous people now, everyone should read Never Split the Difference by Christopher Voss. And what I did was I had Perplexity AI. I asked it to summarize the book, break it into pieces, create frameworks around it. Specifically, what I loved about that book was the section on email and how to the chess game of email. And I just saw something recently, an interview with Chris Voss, where he was like, everything is a chess game. So in an email, you don't put 7 moves. And you and I have talked this. Whenever you talk to a lawyer, whenever you send an email to your lawyer, there's only one thing in it. Never layer questions. Never put 4 things. Because your lawyer is going to respond with one of those things, and it's always going to be the easiest thing. And you just got billed 30 minutes for one response by your lawyer. So as I've thought about that, it's one move at a time in an email. So I had Perplexity like, okay, break down each aspect, and what were the responses from that book in an email and stuff like that. And there are ways of phrasing things that I think really do drive conversion. And by conversion, I mean some sort of reaction, a response, or this or that. So I think just those two things can increasingly improve your response rate and your success rate in your outreach. As far as my course goes, maybe I'll have Perplexity put a course together or something, but it's not, I don't think, if you just do those two things, I don't think you actually need to pay me for it.
Makes sense. So in terms of raising, are you putting it off for now? Because I know elections are coming up.
Yeah.
So how are you thinking about that long-term vision?
Yeah. So, through this year, we took a couple of checks. We did less of an official round. When we were in San Francisco, it was over the summer. I went for Tech Week, and whether for better or worse, there's a lot of time off in the venture world, and that was a period there was a lot of time off. Actually, however, met some really great emerging fund founders, and we can get back to something I really learned on that trip. But so we just decided, especially because we're solely focused on this election right now, and as of today, I think it's 24 days to the election, we are really just focused on user acquisition, running the contests, and iterating and improving what we're doing, and then showing that traction later as we move into post-election, and then our legislative contests and other things, contests beyond elections. And I remain open to the fact that we may not raise. We've started conversations with strategic partners that may end up being a strategic partnership that funds us and we go in a different direction, and we never have to raise an institutional round. So I think it remains to be seen, but yeah, right now it's not the best place for us to focus.
Transitioning into, you said you went to a lot of events, you traveled. How are you picking and choosing where to spend your time? Because traveling to a city, picking an event takes a couple days out of your journey, right? So how do you pick where to spend those days and how to optimize what your experience is there? And if there is, what's the one metric you try to hit when you hit an event? Is it number of people you meet? Is it number of connections you come out of it? Is it just experience? Is there something you're trying to hit when you go to an event, or just winging it?
That's a great question.
I was going to say, what's your KPI, but I don't know.
I may not be that scientific about it. I would say, so San Francisco, I think the last time I was there was like a 10-day trip. It was a bit easier probably for me. I have family in San Francisco, so it was a bit easier. I think the expectation or the kind of the reason behind going was I didn't think I knew well enough about the space, and I had been talking virtually to investors in San Francisco, and I didn't feel like I understood what that ecosystem was like. And I think that I'm better served when I know what an ecosystem values, the way it operates, who are the players, things like that, right? So the KPI.
When you say ecosystem, you mean investor, founder, partners, agencies, whatever.
Yeah, exactly. So that was I think the most broad was like, I've never stepped foot in the Silicon Valley ecosystem. I don't know any founders there. I don't know any investors in person that I've met. I've had calls, but I don't know what their daily, what they're seeing on a daily basis, right? So I have no comparisons. I think so in a scientific way, you need data about the ecosystem. You need, if they're having a video call with me, but then they're going to these events and they're meeting these founders, where do we stack up in that? How are we early compared to them? Are we not doing what other founders or other startups are doing? What would they see, right? So I think that to the greatest degree was really the point, was to understand what people are seeing in their daily life in their home ecosystem. So that would be San Francisco. I mean, DC was a bit different. I was invited to go to DC for really social networking parties around the White House Correspondents' Dinner. And then a couple of weeks later, a tech association put me up for a little over a week to meet with representatives of in the House, senators, and agencies. So the U.S. Department of Commerce, the Trade Commission, Federal Trade Commission, the U.S. Trade Representative, and talk about priorities within the trade association. Data was a big one. AI was a big one, which gave me an opportunity to talk to the staffs, legislators, about what we're doing and what's important to us. And that was where I think you and I spoke about, like, when I talked about what we were doing, they instantly
get it.
Of course, they get it, right? And then, the other two big trips were for the presidential conventions. They, of course, got 100%. They understood it because they are each in these competitive races and they see that there's a natural competition there. So, the response of like, you mean I can make money off of this? And then the focus or the intention in being in each one of those conventions was not the number of conversations. It wasn't anything specific business-wise necessarily, and more to listen and to understand who are the players. How do they think about politics? How do they think about gaming and how do they think about Polymarket and Kalshi, right? So I met people from Polymarket at the Republican convention. They were a very big part of the Republican convention in the influencers area. So understanding those different markets and the players, and it inevitably leads to relationships that I still have. It's led to some really great relationships. So, yeah.
What's been your one big learning from the year of something you thought would make sense, didn't make sense, you learned, you iterated? What's one thing you take away since our first episode?
Yeah, I think just very specifically to Fantasy Elect was for the first year, so let's say 2023, I thought the path to our ideal customer was through fantasy sports, and that our ideal customer was someone who already plays fantasy sports and is very kind of politically inclined, or kind of is a political junkie, or however you would phrase it, right? And I think, and what I realized was that that's not right. Our ideal customer is just a political junkie, may have never played fantasy sports, don't even really care about fantasy sports. What they do like is the idea of, oh, you mean I can win money by engaging in this thing I already engage with, and I can have fun, and it's competitive and social. And then realizing that the path to the ideal customer was not through fantasy sports, but really through political engagement. So we've focused and have onboarded several partners from grassroots organizations through campaigns, through state parties, through young Republicans, young Democrats, college Republicans, college Democrats, any partisan or nonpartisan association that brings those people together. We are focusing on those channels, and as a kind of an overarching channel, political channel, as just like a catch-all for that, as an umbrella that catches all of that. Because those people, those customers, there is no sale that's needed. They get it. That doesn't mean that I don't think the other version is also true, but they're just not the beachhead market. They're not the initial user. I think later on, they come in as well. But
makes sense. Maybe this is a cliched question, but you started roughly December 22, Jan 23. What would you say was your start date for Fantasy Elect?
We started, I pitched it a week after Labor Day 2022.
Okay.
October 8th of 2022 was the first draft of our cohorts of tests, just on Google Sheets and Zoom calls. The very first group to say, would anybody pay money to enter a fantasy political contest? And those contests ran from October 8th to December 8th of 2022 during the midterms. And the midterms weren't decided until about December 8th, the runoff between Walker and Warnock in Georgia. And also Lauren Boebert was actually the last race called that year in Colorado's 3rd district. So the start date for me is October 8th of 2022. So we just passed 2 years.
So what I was going to ask is, knowing everything you know now, knowing all the learnings, everything you've figured out in the last 2.5 years, how do your first 3 months look different from, let's say, December 8th, because that you were still testing for those 2 months?
Drill down on that a little bit. What do you mean? How do they look different?
So your first 3 months, found an agency, trying to build an app, design, whatever, right? Like you did a bunch of stuff in your first 3 months. Knowing everything you know now about building a company, iterating, prototyping, customer acquisition, all the things you've sort of figured out over the last 2 years.
Yeah.
How do your first 3 months now look different if you were to go and
do
like
it again,
redo them, right? That's why I said cliched question.
Got it. To give what you know will be a very kind of like fucking annoying answer is, by the way, is this a R-rated show?
That's
like,
fine.
am I going to get bleeped out? Anyway.
Depends. If I'm monetized by the time this comes out, I'll bleep it out.
Yeah.
If I'm not monetized, I don't care.
Yeah. My niece and nephews point out that I have a really bad mouth, but
Is it the New Yorker inside you?
yeah, the reality is that I don't know. In a way, that question is a resulting question.
100%.
Right?
100%.
So
Or maybe
I made the very best decisions possible
at that time.
at that time. And knowing what I know now is unfair because what I know now is relationships in the industries, relationship with different tech companies, knowing more tech myself, and the macro environment in 2 years, by the way, I could go program it myself with AI and Cursor and all of these things. I could probably do it myself and get an initial product out, right?
Makes sense.
But if somebody else was in the same spot as me now, if I was saying to them, like, this is everything that I went through. And by the way, let me just say this. I think all advice should never just be listened to. It should be considered, but nobody, unless the person can predict the future, their advice is inherently flawed, right? Because they don't know what's going to get you to success. Yeah. They just don't know what's going to get you to success. But what I would say is that this is what I did. Now, what I would do in some ways is the same if the environment were the same, because while the agency that I hired ended up being not delivering on the money that I spent, well, just was never completed, right? And wasn't operable. That forward momentum and that learning was needed, and also being able to show to people that I was recruiting to come on to the team, hey, we're already doing this, this, and this. You can see what we've got here. You can see what we've got here. Even the lawyers, I showed them early on, like, these are what we're doing. And by the way, fully believing that I was going to receive for the money that I had spent a completed product. I wasn't like bullshitting anybody. But that forward momentum led to everything else. The only thing I think, if I were to boil everything down into what I believe, what advice I would give, forward momentum. Keep moving forward. Don't sit and ponder. Don't wait for the right moment. None of that shit exists. Move now. Take a step forward. It might be in a shitty direction. You got to turn around and go the other way, but you don't know it's a shitty direction until you take the first step. But as soon as you take the first step, you now have more information. This goes back to before. Collect more data, make better decisions, make better choices. Now you know more. So I guess it sounds like a dodge. Maybe I'm hedging, but I would just say the only advice I would give to myself now, and I would give to somebody else who's in the same spot, is take a step. And it may not be the same thing I did where I spent tens of thousands of dollars and didn't end up with something. Now I would say something different. I'd probably say like, oh, well, you could probably get some wireframes out, right? Like
maybe another way to ask that question is also, what things did you not focus on that are important to focus on when you're starting out, right? And the reason I'm asking is you talk a lot about customer acquisition.
Yeah.
You talk a lot about building, MVP, iterating, right? And so what I'm trying to get at is I feel like people focus on the wrong things. And like you said, just move is very important of just do one thing better, right? Not everything's great, but you just do one thing better. And then tomorrow, like, oh, I got to fix this sequence. I got to build a funnel. I got to fix the copy here, whatever, right?
Yeah.
It's never going to be perfect. There's always going to be something to do better.
Yeah.
So maybe that's a better way to ask. I don't know.
Based on what you said, I will acknowledge what you're saying is there's a huge kernel of truth in that, right? In some ways, I don't know that it applies to me specifically. So in a way, I always created this somewhat arbitrary ticking clock around elections, which was, it's not arbitrary because we did want to focus, and we do want to focus on delivering product in time for different elections. And this election in particular was a big one for us, right? So by the way, I don't think it's going to be the biggest election. I think 2028 will actually be a more exciting election, and it will be a more, in some ways, I think, a more important election. But we had this arbitrary ticking clock. So the reason I say that is I would say that as a writer, I before wrote comic book, and I
Links in description.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, sales. Although if you're going to bleep me out here, you definitely don't want to download that comic book. But I always thought, and I may have talked about it here before, if you build it, they will come. That's absolutely not fucking true. And somebody said something to me, an author said to me, the day you start writing a book is the day you should start marketing the book. It's going to take at least a year to write that book, and that's a year of marketing that you have every day. Market and write. And I think that's true of consumer apps. I think it's also true of B2B apps, by the way. Sales and everything should happen at the same time, maybe even focus on sales first. But my point in saying that is that in some ways, you're never going to be able to do everything. We didn't have the luxury of validating the idea at each stage before building the product, because we always had the ticking clock of we need a product out by 2023 statewide elections. We need the other product out by primaries. February 2024, we have Iowa caucuses for the Republicans. We always had these deadlines, to some degree self-imposed, but also real deadlines for what we do. So the point being is that every product is going to have its own requirements, and very few products are going to have deadlines to them. Ours does. Fantasy football does. If you want something out by the Super Bowl 2025, you're going to need to fucking build it right now because it needs to be done. So,
and working.
And so, which means you need to get it out. You need to get enough users to test it, figure out where things are broken, fix it, The number of times we've now been through every type of election cycle in the US, midterm, off year, and presidential, we had to redo our data in each cycle because things we just didn't know, we just didn't think about, right? As an aside, anybody who's interested, in the off years, there are 7 states that vote for their state legislature, governor: Virginia, Kentucky, Louisiana, New Jersey. New Jersey and Louisiana are completely different than every other state. Also, Mississippi has the jungle primaries, which means it's a convoluted thing. Google jungle primaries, but that's what they have. So it's a...
you know what you should do? Send me a voice note on what that is.
Yeah.
I'll plug it into the episode.
Yeah, happy to do it. So the point being is that if we had waited, if we had validated, we would have had to redo all that anyway, and our product wouldn't be ready right now. We're operating. We have all of those people that we've been onboarding from different grassroots organizations. They're playing. We have contests starting and ending, and we've figured out ways to create many different contests around legislation and everything else. We never would have done that if we waited to do the $1 million weekend, validate, find your customers, then go build the products. That lead time would have been very.
Is that a jab? I know, Kagan.
Is that what?
Is that a jab?
No, it's just, yes, because he said we couldn't use $1 million weekend. No, it's just a recognition of understanding what your hierarchy, Maslow's hierarchy of needs is. What's the hierarchy of what you need to do for your thing to work? And then prioritizing it. And at the top should always be user acquisition, but figuring out how do you do that within the confines of what you're building. But certainly what I've learned is the profound importance of marketing. I heard a founder on Startup Archive, nobody follows it, I don't know. It's on, you can look him up on Instagram for great little shorts of different founders. But he said, paid advertising prohibits founder market fit. I'm paraphrasing, because it makes you think you have founder market fit because you're buying users. And the only way to have product market fit is if you don't have to spend money on users. I think that's overly simplistic. Nike still pays for advertising. I don't know if they need to, but they do, right? They still pay to acquire users. So I think it's a little overly simplified.
I think there's another way to look at that. It's not always just about acquiring users. Mm-hmm. It's about staying top of mind,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because I know Nikes. I don't buy them every year, every day. But if I see your name enough, the next time I want to buy a pair of shoes, maybe I go to Nike first before going to any other brand, right? And from that perspective, I think that's another side to marketing that people forget is why do Coke and Pepsi still do marketing?
Yeah, right.
It's not to sell more,
Right.
It's more, hey, when you have to make a choice, I want my name to be the first name off the tip of your tongue more than anything else.
That's a great point. I mean, if anybody who's interested in what we're talking about in this moment I would recommend going to YouTube and typing in Nike versus Adidas Olympic campaign. Adidas paid, I think it was $1 billion for the to be the Olympic sponsor. And the marketing campaign that Nike ran, nobody remembers that Adidas was the actual sponsor of the Olympics. And this was a couple of Olympics ago. It doesn't matter. But what they did was brilliant.
You're old.
Because I'm old, exactly. And for a startup, especially, because now we're talking about a very mature company, but for a startup, I do think that what the gentleman said, I don't even remember who it was now on Startup Archive, but what he said was just overly simplistic because you must find ways to acquire users, even if they aren't product market fit yet. You need people to use it and tell you what's wrong with it. You need to observe why there's churn. I personally I do Zoom calls with our users. I send out emails with surveys. I talk to them like, oh, what did you like here? I noticed you haven't entered a contest since this one. Why? Was there something you didn't like? Or, oh, you've been in a bunch of contests. That's amazing. What's your favorite thing? Like, what keeps bringing you back? So marketing is my whole point. I think marketing is a skill. User acquisition, let's just say, is a broad thing because it could be PR, it could be marketing, it could be any number of things, but it is a skill that will serve most founders better than being a technical founder building a product, in my opinion.
I forgot why we
That's a hot take.
I forgot why we went on the marketing rant.
You asked me the first 3 months from December to what would I do differently? Yeah. I would just say I think I even said in our last episode, in the last one we did, I didn't want to make the marketing mistake again. I don't think we made the marketing mistake again, but I also think we could have done more. And I think that we can always do more. However, there are always only going to be 24 hours in a day. That's the reality of it. And when you're early, you're constantly balancing priorities and figuring out what's the one thing I can do that's going to deliver 80% of the returns. And I think marketing is almost always the answer in that, but it's not always the answer in that. Sometimes you can market it, but if people come onto your product and it's shit and it doesn't work, there was no point in bringing those users on. There are other types of marketing that you can do, which is just content-based. Like our newsletter is just content-based. I was talking about with my advisor recently. That is specifically building a brand and a relationship. People love art. I've gotten emails back from people who I love this content. I love what you put out. It's basically, anyway, it doesn't matter. We can get into that if you want, but there are different things you can do for marketing that are not based around user acquisition. They're just based on brand and awareness, like you said.
Makes sense. What does the next year look like for you? So
that's a great question.
We're recording before elections. Yeah. I don't know when this is going to come out, but how are you doing things gearing up to that? Are you leveraging the social media, I don't know what the word I'm looking for, like volume behind the upcoming elections to acquire more users? And then once that happens, what does the fizzle out look like for you? What do you focus on after?
Yeah, we've already started talking, or I've had conversations with certain political partners and friends. Again, this goes back to the value of going to the presidential conventions. I also went to the Texas State Convention. I've already started talking to some Texas partisan people that I know about the Texas legislature goes back into session January 2025, building a contest and probably an ongoing contest around this legislative session in Texas, and also identifying how to do contests in other states where we may not have actual specific partners and friends within those legislatures or within those states. But how can we use AI tools and other things to figure out, okay, what's going to be put before those legislatures? And at the national level, we're going to run a lot of legislative contests what bills are going to pass, what's going to happen here, what's going to happen there. So for us, it's going to be a pivot into the off-year election cycle. And there's a period between the end of this election till about April, May, when the primaries will start to happen for the statewide elections, governors, state legislatures. So we're really going to lean into that. And then, like I said, may or may not actually focus on raising, depends on what the conversation is like with some of the initial strategic partnership conversations that we've had. Where do those go? And what are the things that, what are the opportunities that we see, But I think that's currently, those are our objectives, or those are the things that we're keeping an eye on where we want to go.
Nice. And then, maybe I sound dumb, but over the 3 years between both elections, presidential elections, is there always something happening at a state level, or like what events do you focus on? Are there always some kind of elections for you to use and piggyback off of and use as sort of a strategy for acquisition? Or is there like a dead period where, hey, this year nothing happens?
It's actually not a, did you say it was a dumb question or an ignorant?
Yeah.
I don't remember what word you used. It's actually not, by the way, because this is actually something that even VCs have said, which is just factually inaccurate. They think there is a 4-year gap between, and that's not true, actually. So about 55% of registered voters vote for president. So that's every 4 years. About 48 to 49% of registered voters vote in the midterms. So you're still looking at about 115 million Americans are engaged in midterms, which are 2 years between each presidential cycle, right? So let's just look at those two, because those are federal cycles. So forget about the state. The time period between those two things. So let's just assume this year, the federal election for president, it ends. Now, I'm going to go ahead and say right now that generally speaking, I don't see for the foreseeable future, probably for the next generation, where any federal election will be determined on election day. I think we're going to see more runoffs. I think things are just getting tighter and closer. So around December, who won. That's when we can end our contests, right? So let's say from December, and then when does so this year, December 2024, when will the actual cycle begin for the midterms? That is about 9 months. So by September 2025, you will start to see a ramping up of things happening around the midterm cycle. And then March, April of 2026, there will be primaries happening for that midterm cycle in each state. If you look at when things start ramping up in September, it's almost exactly the time period between fantasy football. Fantasy football ends in December, mid-December, the playoffs happen, Super Bowl's in the following year, and then there's nothing again until September, late August, early September. Actually, the season usually starts in the first or second week of September. So it's almost the same time period. So it's actually a great question. Most people don't think about it. Now, that's not even taking into account in the odd years, there are those 7 states that have elections. So between election cycles at both the federal and state level, there's months. It's less than any professional sports season, actually. And that doesn't even include the fact that we want to bring in more municipal elections, New York City election. I mean, Mayor Eric Adams in New York has been indicted. He's like, my assumption is that he will likely resign. There's going to be some sort of special election. I don't think he's going to survive. So you have, New York, Chicago, Miami, Austin, Dallas, LA, San Francisco. You have all these elections, municipal elections happening in cities that some are during even years, some are during midterms, some are during presidential cycles. But point being is there's a lot of content there for us to run contests around.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
I did not know Bloomberg was a billionaire until he tried running, I think.
Yeah.
And I was like, I don't know why this guy's worth 60
He might
plus
be
billion.
in the top 15, top
like
10.
with 60, 70 billion. I was like,
Yeah. Bloomberg News, man.
I didn't connect the dots, right? Like the Bloomberg terminal and everything.
Yeah.
How do you think about, with everything you've learned over the last year, with customer acquisition going forward, what channels do you think you're going to be spending more time in that you were not spending time in?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think we haven't put as much focus into Reddit. And the reason is because it's a very segmented, it's not like X where you can
Get visibility.
get a lot of visibility across the platform. So, and that may or may not be a good thing, by the way. Reddit may actually be, pound for pound, may actually be more effective just because it is so niche and focused, right? Also, one of the things with Reddit is with the upvotes and the downvotes, probably better user experience is there's less self-serving content on Reddit. You don't see a lot of like people posting in a Reddit chain about, oh, we're doing this. Because the moderators will be like, that looks like promotion to us. That's blocked. And when you get blocked, it's very hard to get back into that. So that's one of the reasons we've kind of avoided it until we have a bigger team and people who can really focus on communities within that. That's really what I want to focus when it comes to user acquisition, is actually a team that is focused on communities rather than platforms. So your focus is on libertarian. Your focus is on progressives. Your focus is on Democratic Socialists of America. Your focus is on whatever else, right? And breaking that down properly by saying you focus on Reddit, maybe also Twitter, but more focus on Reddit. And then they're just engaging naturally, right? I also think there's a bit of a strategy there for affiliates or influencers or something like that. But Reddit is, I think, it's a nut that we haven't cracked yet. So that would be the one I think that could actually yield great dividend, but is going to require a long lead in to understanding it. And we're going to make a lot of mistakes early on, which wasn't worth our resources, mostly on time. The way X was, it's a much lower barrier to entry for X. So Reddit, probably.
Makes sense. How do you divide your focus if you were to draw a pie chart?
Yeah.
10% investing, 20% customer acquisition, 40% product. How do you split your time for Fantasy Elect?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, so pretty much
Naps in the day should also be part of that.
The what?
Naps during the day.
Naps for sure. Yeah, lots of naps. The bags under my eyes, I'm sure, make nobody believes there's a nap in my life. The reality is, I think, so every Wednesday is like a content day for me. Record a podcast with our political advisor, take the podcast, break it into smaller shorts, use the outline that we built the podcast from to create a newsletter. Oftentimes there's also some sort of LinkedIn learning that goes into that. And then, so that's a content day really. The rest of the week, I would say it's broken into kind of really two areas only, especially now because we're not focusing on investing. User acquisition, so marketing, that kind of in a way also, I would also say, overlaps with product, which is the other half, in that getting user feedback, using that user feedback for changes on product and also maybe changes in marketing. Because I also ask, like, where did you hear about us? Where would you expect to see something about us? And you know what I mean? So you half the day is user acquisition, half the day is product. And it's really those three things: content, product, and user acquisition.
Oh, pretty cool.
Is there something we should be doing that we're not doing that comes to mind?
Anything else you want to cover from your last year?
Yeah, I think, well, the funny thing is, I mean, I've shared the episode that we did. I've always warned people that it's very, very philosophical. I'm not sure how much startup advice is in it, but I would say that everything I said philosophically has proven to be very true. Just the changes in how I think, the changes in priority, the value of doing it, the value of starting a company in who you become in the process, the relationships that you make, the people that are focusing on the same thing. That goes back to San Francisco as well. The value of going to San Francisco is that you're in an ecosystem around people who are really focused on very similar mindset, if not same product, same industry, same anything, but they have the same mindset as you. They have the same interests as you, which are usually like understanding relationships between customers, products, solving problems, getting money. So I would say that has been, I'm surprised how right I was in some ways about the value of what I'm doing.
Nice.
Yeah.
We'll do the one question segment.
Sure.
It's funny. I texted Shreya the question just so I have it.
Oh, nice.
And she ended up answering it. And she's like, why? And I'm like,
okay, let's
don't answer it. Don't answer it.
Yeah.
I'm just
well, let's
saying.
compare. Let's compare what the answers are.
So what do you think is the most important in your team's culture on your road to success?
What is the most important thing about our team's culture on the road to success? Okay, cool. I probably would like to turn that maybe into a conversation a bit, because I would say like there's so many different ways of saying the same thing. I would say probably the word that jumps right out at me is trust. And I mean that in so many different directions. So me trusting the team that we have to not come to me for things, like solve the problem. And if you can solve it without me, then I don't need to be involved. Also, the team trusting me to, if they do something or somebody tries something or wants to, that they know I trust them. So they trust me to trust them. And also, just because you try something and it doesn't work doesn't mean you did something wrong.
Yeah.
Like nothing, very few things work the first time. I would never hold that against someone. So trust is probably the thing that jumps out the most. Also, part of that trust is this thing that I'm kind of obsessed with, is like this idea, Amazon called back so many of their people back to office. And I think all of that comes from a lack of trust. And another word for trust might be confidence, in that, granted, listen, it's a big organization, so who am I to judge, right? They have different priorities than I have and stuff like that. But I would say that there is, in my opinion, as an outside observer, this ideology among the managerial class of like, if I don't see you working, I don't know if you're working.
Yeah.
And I think that is a lack of trust in the people they've hired. I think it's a lack of trust in themselves to be able to manage someone that they can't look at. I think it's a lack of confidence in themselves as managers. And I think it may also be a realization that most managers aren't needed. And that scares somebody who's a manager, because then you're like, oh, they're getting the work done and I don't need to oversee them. Like, that doesn't look good for my job.
Yeah.
So that might be a jaded view of it, but it has been what I've observed in the kind of corporate culture of the world. Whereas I have trust, like, it's so funny the number of times where I might want to meet with the CTO. But the reason I want to meet with him is just to have a conversation. Very rarely do I want to meet with him and say, hey,
an update.
Exactly, because I don't need to do that, because we're on Slack. And he just tells me, hey, I did this. This is done. I'm still working on this. Cool. And I don't even need that, by the way, because I just make an assumption that he's working on it, which for better or worse, right? But when I do want to talk to him and have a conversation, my message to him on Slack has usually been like, hey, is it worth it right now for us to have a conversation next week? Or do you want to stay heads down working on what you're working on? And he'll respond, yeah, let's have a conversation. Or let me get through what I'm doing and then let's talk later in the week or the next week. Cool. And then I'll say, awesome, give me days and times that work for you, right? And I think I have enough confidence in myself. I think there's a Harvard Business School thing would be like, what do you mean? You let them give you the day and time? You don't dictate as the leader? And like, what kind of leader would I be if I needed to like keep people down and be like, I'm the boss? That's stupid. Do you know what I mean? So I have the trust in them, and I think it's earned trust in me by them, and they know that I don't have an ego in the fight. Like, I care about the outcome. It doesn't really matter to me, So I think that culturally has been a huge benefit for us. And again, I don't know that you can maintain that in a large organization over time, but maybe most organizations don't even need to be as big as they are. You know what I mean? So trust is kind of the word that jumped right into my mind about the key differentiator.
Nice.
Yeah.
What's your question for my next guest?
Oh man, I forgot you do this in a way.
Looks like I haven't been listening to my episodes.
I did tell you what I do in a day, and listening to Funds and Founders it's not in user acquisition or in product. Maybe it should be though. I probably get some good insight. I mean, I think one interesting question could be around that. Has anybody answered about kind of that back return to work? Has anybody answered or talked about that at all? I think it would be interesting.
Maybe I had a CTO on who's very pro remote. But yeah.
Okay. Well, maybe there's a way to frame that question, which is what would need to be true for them to give up the idea of actively managing the day-to-day of their team and instead being very clear on the strategic priorities with a why for the team, and from that point only offering support to the team when needed to achieve those outcomes, those strategic priorities, regardless where they are. Because I think that is really the primary focus of a CEO is...
The reason this is a tough question is it assumes the person I'm going to ask it to is actively managing their team.
Yeah, okay. Or you could also invert it, though. You could say what had to be true for you to be able to do that. Or if you don't currently do it, what would need to be true for you to do that, right? So, because I just think that as I look at the designer that I brought on lives in London. I never met him in person. Would there ever be a world where we would raise and we would be worth $100 million and I'd be like, all right, dude, now you got to move to Austin? No, I don't. Why do I care where he lives when he's working online? It just doesn't matter to me. So anyway, and the interesting thing, not to get on a soapbox about this, but the interesting thing about this is the willingness of large corporations to outsource work to other companies in other parts of the world, but not want their own staff to live somewhere else. What fucking sense does that make? And anybody who knows anybody that works at Amazon, they will tell you a good portion of the people who are doing certain jobs are outsourced. Yeah. India, Colombia, wherever. But now you're doing a return to work for so many people? What sense does that make? So for me, I think it is a demonstration of the weakness of the mindset of the managerial class within that organization more than it is a demonstration of necessity for some positions. For other positions, it may be needed to be in an office, but I don't think it's true for the sheer number. And by the way, was it Jason Calcanis who it was somebody from the All In Pod, might have been Sachs, it might have been one of the others, but legitimately talking about, like, I'm going to paraphrase, but like the people who were doing fake work now having to go back to work and do real work. It's like, were they not delivering what the organization asked of them? Because if they were, then what do you mean the not doing work? Yeah. Maybe you just don't know how to manage. Maybe you just don't know how to set the priorities, or maybe the issue really, there's a saying in the military, there are no bad leaders. There are no bad followers. There are only bad leaders. So it's like, maybe the issue is not with your staff.
The people, yeah. Have you seen that tweet that went viral? Like, Zach from Austin, he posted a thing of Zilker 2 p.m. like on a Wednesday or Tuesday. A bunch of people doing yoga. Got like 20, 30 million impressions on Twitter. And people are like, what are people doing? This is what work from home is. And it just sparked a debate of like, it's okay to take an hour to go to the gym, right? Or whatever. Yeah. And so it's an interesting dynamic of what's the reason for people not wanting work from home? Is it to cut out the fat of the company where people are not doing work? But
inherent in that tweet or whatever that was are a lot of assumptions.
Yeah, 100%.
There is plenty of data that actually shows that people work more from home. I don't think working from home is necessarily healthy, because I think people work too much from home. There is no bifurcation of your life. People wake up, sit in bed, work all day, and then they will work for longer periods of time, and they don't get a chance to live it. I think it could be a less healthy lifestyle. Yeah. It's harder to find work-life balance when work is in the middle of your home.
Makes sense.
Also, I don't know that there's enough benefit there, because now your internet connection, your lights, your phone, your everything is part of a business expense and you're not being reimbursed for it. In some ways, maybe I'm part of the proletariat. I'm very pro-worker. I'm like, I think companies benefit from work from home. They could start to sublet some of their office space. They could get rid of it. They don't have to pay for electricity. They don't have to pay for internet connections. They don't have to do all these things. The workers are taking that expense on. But people like it because if they are working 12 hours a day now, they do work in bed until midnight and get up at 8 and work, right? Then who cares if they went and did yoga for an hour? Why do you give a shit? Did they not deliver what you asked them? That's all I care about.
Yeah.
So I think there are a lot of assumptions in there, and I don't think they prove to be accurate based on the data that's available.
What do you want to plug? Where should people reach out? What
Yeah, that's awesome. So Fantasy Elect, I think it's Fantasy_elect on Twitter, Instagram, at Fantasy Elect on TikTok. Have a lot of fun on some of the things that we do there. We're actually, we're starting to do this thing where we're looking at the differences in how do you date in this very politicized world. Have I told you about what we're doing? So if you look at the graph of especially Gen Z women are becoming way more liberal and Gen Z men are becoming way more conservative than any other demographic, any other like age group, generation. So how is dating going to work when at the same time most people, about 80%, I think it's 80 something percent of Democrats say they will not date a Republican, and it's slightly less, it's like 76 or something percent of Republicans say they won't date a Democrat. So as we're seeing the split, how are you going to reconcile those things? And what's it going to mean for interpersonal romantic relationships over time if now politics is becoming such an important, dating is becoming politicized, right? So for us, we're starting to look at having a little bit of fun about that. We, maybe there's like enter a contest and go on a date. I also kind of want to play with the idea of, do you remember the TikTok song, I'm looking for a man in finance, trust fund, 6'5", blue eyes. I created a couple AI songs around like, I'm looking for a guy who's dates, is respectful like a Southern MAGA, and he's like, but he's, supportive like New York woke or whatever, right? Like those kind of like stereotypical things. So anyway, you'll see that on our
Sweet.
TikTok.
But thanks for coming on.
My pleasure.